Almost 4 years into a war that's led to the world's worst humanitarian catastrophe, can a peace deal ever be reached in Yemen? I'll ask this week's headliner, the foreign minister of the Houthi rebel-led government, Hisham Sharaf. I'm Mehdi Hassan, also on the show. Almost 30 years ago, Francis Fukuyama said we'd arrived at the end of history. He wasn't quite right about that. And now he's back with a new thesis which says identity politics is undermining liberal democracy. I'll ask him why. But first, the UN has called the civil war in Yemen the worst man-made humanitarian crisis of our time. Most place the blame for it on the Saudi-led coalition, which has bombed and blockaded Yemen for more than 3 years now. But the Houthi rebels, who seized control of part of the country in 2014 and forced the president to flee, have also been accused of violating international law. So what's their responsibility for the crisis in Yemen? This week's headliner, Foreign Minister of that Houthi-led government, Hisham Sharaf. Hisham Sharaf, thanks for joining me on UpFront. Can I begin by asking you, what is your official title?
I am the Foreign Minister of the National Salvation Government, which is a coalition between the GPC, General People Congress, and Ansarullah, the Houthis.
And you accept, though, don't you, that the rest of the world doesn't consider you to be the foreign minister. They consider you to be part of a regime that lacks international legitimacy. No one recognizes your National Salvation Government.
Yes, I do understand this, but I do represent my country. I represent 85% of the population who are living with us, who are dealing with us. I think this is enough for me.
Okay.
And anyone who would like to deal with this part of the world will deal with the de facto government established here in Sanaa.
And you're right about the de facto government, although those 85% of the people didn't vote for you. Do you accept that Abdurrabbu Mansur Hadi is the legitimate president of Yemen under international law?
As they specify under their international law, but according to the wishes and the constitution of the Republic of Yemen, he has resigned. In the new arrangements for peace, we will have our own election or our own arrangements to have a new president.
Just to be clear, UN Security Council Resolution 2216 says he is the only legitimate president of Yemen, whether you like him or not. You talk about peace. Your side of the conflict, the National Salvation Government of Yemen, which of course includes the Houthis, failed to attend the Geneva peace talks that were scheduled in September. Will you also be refusing to attend the upcoming UN peace talks in Sweden to try and end this horrific civil war, to try and end this Saudi-led bombing campaign?
No. We have announced that we are going to Sweden for these consultations in Stockholm, and what happened concerning Geneva was the obstacles, or were the obstacles that was put by the other side. Our people were ready to go, and I myself met them one night before they go, or they were intending to go.
Let's talk details. Mohammed Ali al-Houthi, a senior Houthi official, recently wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post newspaper claiming that if the Saudi airstrikes stopped, there would be peace in Yemen. It sounds kind of simplistic, vague even. What actually are you proposing from your side to end the war? We know what the Saudis are doing, but what is your side proposing to end this war?
Okay, let me be very clear. When we asked for stopping the bombardment by the Saudis, we have really expressed our wish for peace by the same things they mentioned, that you guys stop your planes from coming to our airspace and bombing our people and killing them, and we will not send any of these ballistic missiles. This will be just a gesture to go ahead with other peace arrangement. It's not simplistic at all. The Saudis a long time say, stop the ballistic missiles, withdraw from the borders, we can arrange something. Now we tell them, enough is enough, let's go for peace, stop those planes from coming and killing our population.
It's undeniably true that the Saudi-led coalition has killed most of the civilians in this war and bears greatest responsibility for the humanitarian crisis that's unfolded and may also have committed war crimes. And I asked a Saudi ambassador to the United Nations on this show about that. We've covered the Saudi role in this war extensively on UpFront. But the fact is that your side of the conflict, the Houthi-led side, has also been accused by the UN, by Amnesty International, by Human Rights Watch of serious human rights abuses, including blocking foreign aid, torturing detainees, hostage-taking, using child soldiers, shelling civilian areas. That's a pretty damning, pretty horrific indictment of your quote-unquote government, isn't it?
I will not call it indictment of our government or our authorities. During the wars, any war, things happen. And as I said, we are open and transparent. We would like to see these things and correct any misdoings. We didn't say that we are clean 100%. Things happen during the war. So again, we are trying our best to limit any incidents that is coming from our side. But you are talking about planes that are throwing hundreds and thousands of tons of bombs on civilians. If you speak about us, the National Salvation and our military, we are trying our best to limit any incidents of killing people or, as you said, recruiting children.
But human rights groups don't agree with you. You say things happen as if it's some sort of accident or natural disaster, when Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, the UN have documented over many months, not over days or weeks, over consistent pattern over many months of Houthi forces indiscriminately firing explosive munitions into residential areas, into markets, into houses, into civilian areas. How can you justify that? That's a violation of the laws of war.
I mean, let me tell you something. I'm not coming here to justify. As I said, any misdoings or any kind of an action that is hurting our population, we are ready to talk about it, investigate it, and check it. Anyone who did a mistake, we are going to punish them. But you are talking about a small fraction, a very small fraction of the killing that happened in our country. If we get 10% of that, the Saudis and their coalition is responsible for 90% of the killing in Yemen.
I accept that the Saudi coalition is responsible for the majority of civilian deaths. That doesn't excuse the civilian deaths at the hands of Houthi forces. That doesn't excuse torture by the Houthi forces. That doesn't excuse shelling of civilian areas. Do you accept that point?
Okay, let me here say something. We are ready to receive those human rights groups to look to what's happening. How did it happen, and how we can correct the course of the war against the aggression, by which we avoid our population and not hit them, or, as you said, throw some rockets to them. But again, I say, we are defending our country. We are not fighting our people.
And what about the rockets fired into Saudi Arabia? 100 rockets, according to some reports, into Saudi Arabia, into Riyadh, some of which have indiscriminately targeted residential areas, killed Saudi citizens, killed an Egyptian laborer. How is that not a war crime to target civilian areas in a neighboring country, no matter what they're doing to you?
Let me correct it to you. It's 192 rockets and maybe more, not 100 rockets.
So you're proud of the rockets you fired into Saudi Arabia?
Oh, yes, we defend our country. If you would go to the story of this war, the first 2 years, we did not fire anything. We just were waiting to stop this crazy war. Then we did not find any response from the world. So we started defending our country by shooting some rockets to that country. Now, the number that you mentioned about some Saudis who were hit, or that Egyptian citizen, what's that number? Give it to me, and I can tell you that they killed 50,000 persons in our country. They injured more than that number, and they
Minister, we've covered that on this show. Two wrongs.
So don't compare.
Sorry, I'm not comparing. You're the one comparing. Two wrongs don't make a right, Minister. I'm not defending the Saudi killing of civilians in Yemen. I'm asking you how you defend the killing of Saudi civilians. It's a simple question. Are you okay with killing Saudi civilians? Yes or no?
Please, no. We don't consent to that. We don't consent to killing any civilian. It might happen by mistake, but we don't intend to kill the Saudis because they are not our enemies. Our enemy is the military planes. And if we have some rockets to shoot those planes, we would have done it. But we don't have them.
OK, and one of the main reasons this war continues to rage on is because it's not just a Yemeni civil war, it's become a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And you're on the Iranian side, aren't you? The Iranians back the Houthis and your National Salvation Government. That's a fact, isn't it?
Okay, speaking on behalf of the National Salvation Government, we have no dealing with Iran. I myself requested the Iranians sometime to provide us with anti-aircraft missiles. They didn't give it to us. I tell you, these Scud missiles, we have them 10, 20 years ago, and we modified something in them to defend ourselves. Everything in our country has been destroyed by the Saudis. So when we come and shoot 1 or 10 or 20 missiles to Saudi Arabia to show them we can't defend our country, the whole world become a little bit worried. They should worry about those planes who kill people while they're asleep. We are trying to defend Yemen, and we will use our weapons if this war does not stop. We would like to have peace, so let's go to peace. Peace is our aim.
Hold on, Minister. So do you deny reports that suggest Iran has sent not just missiles, but military advisors to Yemen to advise your forces? Do you deny claims from Iran-backed Hezbollah commanders that they've been helping you launch those rockets into Saudi Arabia?
As the foreign minister of the National Salvation Government, I deny that my government is dealing with Iran whatsoever.
Whatsoever? There are no Iranian military advisors on the ground in Yemen?
I'm telling you, I'm the foreign minister. I visit a lot of places. I visit a lot of our commanders, and I don't see any Iranian advisors at the Ministry of Defense or any places, any places that I visit. So those who are saying this, like Nikki Haley and like the others in the US, they should tell us where they are, and they should tell us how they did found about them.
A Hezbollah commander named Abu Abbas told Foreign Affairs magazine that Hezbollah is already in Yemen. Quote, "Who do you think fires missiles into Saudi Arabia? It's not the Houthis in their sandals, it's us," he said. Is he lying?
Okay, this guy is liable and responsible for what he has stated. But as I say, as a foreign minister of the National Salvation Government, we have nothing about that. And I have the Minister of Defense meeting with us in regular meetings. We did not talk about that.
Okay, one of the other big problems in Yemen is not just outside intervention, but that everyone in Yemen seems to switch sides all the time. Your former boss, the late President Ali Abdullah Saleh, and the government you were part of fought 6 wars against the Houthis between 2004 and 2011. Then they teamed up with the Houthis to fight the Saudis, and then a year ago, he ditched the Houthis, calling them reckless, and the late President Saleh got killed by them. Do you worry that if you disagree with your coalition partners, the Houthis as well, they'll turn on you too?
Let me tell you something. I'm serving in this government for the Republic of Yemen, not for the parties. So I'm serving my country, I'm defending my country, and I do this all the time. So when it comes about what happened in, last year, we did not have all the facts yet. We did not have about the details of what happened. But again, as the GPC, we have the coalition with our brothers from the Houthi or the Ansarullah, and we will continue that until peace comes, and then we will know all the details. So,
but did you approve of your brothers, the Houthis, killing your former boss, your former leader, Ali Abdullah Saleh?
No. This is the chairman of our party, and some events happened, and we will know eventually what happened. But until now, I can tell you, we did not know what happened, and our party did not ask us for any withdrawal. So we are continuing with this National Salvation Government for the sake of the Yemeni people, not for the sake of parties.
And one last question. Yemen used to be divided between north and south. It's divided right now because of this ongoing war. Is the only chance for peace, is the only long-term solution to the conflict in Yemen to make that division formal, to bring back partition?
Nope. In my opinion, as Mr. Martin Griffith said, first let's bring peace to Yemen, and then let's look to the issue of the south. Now, what is in front of us is peace for Yemen, stop the war, lift the blockade, open Sanaa airport, let the people move, and let the politicians talk. After we solve this issue of what's going on now, then we can look to any other major issues that is happening in our country. Anyone who wants to face the Iranians should go to the Strait of Hormuz, not to come to Sanaa or come to Aden or any other place in our country, the Republic of Yemen.
Hisham Sharaf, thanks for joining me on UpFront. What comes after the end of history? Back in 1989, when the Berlin Wall had fallen and the end of the Soviet Union was near, US political scientist Francis Fukuyama argued that the success of Western liberal democracy suggested that humanity had arrived at the close of a great ideological struggle. But nearly 30 years later, democracy is under assault across the globe with the rise of authoritarian, illiberal and nationalist governments. In his new book, Identity, the Demand for Dignity and the Politics of Resentment, Francis Fukuyama criticizes what he says is a traditional left-right spectrum of politics giving way to one defined by identity. Francis Fukuyama, thanks for joining me on UpFront. In your new book, Identity, you argue that so-called identity politics is one of the chief threats to liberal democracies today. How do you define identity politics, and how is what you're saying any different to what conservatives have been complaining about for years?
Well, identity is based on this feeling that I have this inner self that's not being adequately recognized, and what I want more than resources or stuff is actually recognition and respect. And that's what drives groups to enter into politics, because they feel as members of groups, particularly if they've been marginalized, that they're not getting respect, and they want that from the political system. And liberal democracy is based on individuals, not on group memberships and not on, these.
Yeah, there's some very thoughtful parts of the book, and then there's bits where you make some sweeping statements. You say Black Lives Matter is fighting for equality and basic rights. ISIL, extremist group, terrorist group, whatever you want to call it, has a very genocidal approach to the rest of the world, isn't fighting for equality and justice, clearly. But then you seem to lump them together in this critique of identity politics. You literally put them together on the same page.
Yeah. Well, morally, obviously, they're not equivalent at all. I think what's the same is actually the psychology, because if you look at the psychology of many people that sign up for ISIS, they believe that Muslims around the world are being disrespected, killed, disregarded, and that they need agency, and that their membership in this group is what's going to give them both community, fellowship with other Muslims. They're going to be able to support that group. Now, of course, the way they do it is terrible.
Yeah.
And it's,
But to say that ISIL and Black Lives Matter are different manifestations of the same phenomenon is a little bit too far, isn't it?
They're manifestations of a similar psychological phenomenon. The only way I'm saying that these groups are comparable is in that psychological phenomenon whereby that demand for dignity is very deeply rooted in all of us. It may be more justified in some cases than in others, but there is a common framework in which this happens.
One of the other important arguments that you raise in the book is about class. You talk about the importance of challenging inequality. Many would say that there's a intersectional politics. They talk about race and class. You can't treat these things on their own, and sometimes solving one problem doesn't solve the other. For example, if we say actually we should focus on class, not identity issues, race issues, how do you deal with a recent study which found that black boys raised in the US, even in the wealthiest families, living in the nicest neighborhoods, are still less likely to earn in adulthood what white boys with similar backgrounds might earn? They're more likely to become poor than to stay wealthy. Now, in that scenario, dealing with class and income is not enough. You have to deal with the racism and the discrimination that they're enduring.
Yeah, no, so everybody is subject to that kind of discrimination, but I think there's also a ton of empirical data out there that actually shows that class defined by your level of education, basically whether you've got a higher education or just a high school education or less, is really the single thing that's the most determinative of your life opportunities and outcomes.
You say that, and yet, as I say,
and it cuts across ethnic,
it doesn't always
racial.
cut across. You say that the study I'm citing from the Equality of Opportunity Project, a group of researchers at your college, Stanford, Harvard, and the Census Bureau, they found that black men raised in the top 1% by millionaires were as likely to be incarcerated as white men raised in households earning $36,000 a year. You can't say that class is some kind of leveler.
I mean, there's plenty of data showing that education is really what's important in determining outcomes. Now, access to education is one of the big disadvantages that black people in the United States have, and so that's, that is something that is determined by race. But I do think that, if you look at the overall phenomenon of inequality in the United States, a lot of that is in the white population, because the white population has gone in these two opposite directions as well. Well-educated white people have done extremely well. Poorly educated white people have fallen off a social cliff in many respects.
So I want to push back on your education point, because it does feel a little bit utopian. If you take France, which you also talk about in the book, you say, for example, if the French liberalize their labor laws, that will help minority communities who feel marginalized, left out of the economy. And yet all of the surveys show that, for example, in France, if your name is Mohammed, you're 4 times less likely to be invited back for a job interview, even with the same CV, same resume, as your Christian, white, Catholic counterpart. Education doesn't solve that problem. That's a race issue. That requires quote-unquote identity politics.
I say that, you know, all of these specific forms of discrimination are bad. There's a perfectly good reason for pushing back against these specific forms of discrimination. But I also think that you need to balance that with a sense of citizenship and a sense of broader political community if you're going to sustain a democracy.
Do you not agree that the real threat from identity politics in the United States to Western societies as a whole comes not from the left's supposed obsession with ethnic minorities or transgender rights, but from a president of the United States who has enabled and stoked white nationalism, neo-Nazism?
That's why I wrote the book. I mean,
well, you say that's why I wrote the book, but there's a lot of, it feels like you're trying to bend over backwards to do this kind of, the right's bad, but the left's bad.
No, I'm trying
to. The right is a neo-Nazi right now.
I'm trying to explain, you know, the rise of the right, and I think that there is a kind of tone deafness from people on the left to actually what bothers people and what has made a lot of people vote for these populist candidates, not just in the United States, but in Europe as well. Some of it is just racism, xenophobia, and so forth, but a lot of it is, you know, driven by other things, that elites really have not paid a lot of attention to a, you know, fairly broad swath of America that constitutes, you know, when you think about the, you know, the 99%, a lot of those people are in there. And I think that if you don't figure out what is bothering them, you're not going to solve the underlying problem that is driving the polarization in the United States.
But I'm asking you, would you accept, is it an equal, is it, it's asymmetric polarization?
Yeah,
do you accept?
It's asymmetric, yeah. So I think the social justice issues are largely, you know, held by the left-wing groups, but I do think that there's also
legitimate things on the right,
legitimate
in addition to the racism and bigotry. Just talk about yourself. What about you? How would you define your own identity? You're the grandson of Japanese immigrants to the United States.
Well, you know, whenever I'm asked that, and this was true ever since I was a child, I'd say I'm an American. I mean, I never thought of myself as an Asian American or a Japanese American, and I always thought, you know, part of the reason that it's great to be in America is that I don't have to think that way.
When you see, for example, Asian Americans wanting to assert a group identity, wanting to be better represented in public life or popular culture, you have the recent hit movie, Crazy Rich Asians, which has topped the box office, the first all-Asian cast. That's been celebrated by a great deal of Asian Americans. Is they wrong to celebrate that? Black Americans who look at Black Panther and say, finally, a movie with a black cast, a black director. Isn't that something to celebrate, or is that something you think is dangerous or wrong?
I don't think it's dangerous or wrong. I mean, I don't, you know, I don't particularly celebrate it, but
you don't care that
well, you know,
more people who look like you should be on film.
It represents something. It's not really a movie about America. You know, it's about a lot of rich Chinese in Singapore. You know, I mean, they're connected to America, but you know, it's a phenomenon about the rise of China.
Black Panther is about a fictional country. It's not about the storyline. It's about who you see on screen, the writers, the director, the actors, who you have as role models. You don't think that's important to, you know, in this age of identity? No?
I think I've had a pretty interesting, successful life, and it never depended on me seeing a lot of Asian role models out there. I, you know, never thought that that was important in shaping my own career or whatever I did. I thought that...
Do you recognize you're probably quite distinctive and in a minority on that? Most people do want some kind of role models.
Yeah. I mean, and also Asians are different from African Americans, and they're different from, you know, other women, and they're different.
Which is the whole point, which is why they want to see.
No, but I'm just saying
why
that
everyone wants to get a bit of representation.
Well, yeah, but you know, I just think that representation by itself oftentimes conflicts with other kinds of social values that are important. Like right now, there's this big fight going on in the New York public school system about who gets access to these elite public high schools. And in that case, representation, you know, the representation argument acts directly against the interests of Asian Americans because they're way overrepresented in those schools because they do better on tests and so forth. And so I think, you know, there's a lot of competing goods here. And if your single focus is on representation, it's, you know, it's going to conflict with some of those other values.
You're most famous for your essay in the phrase, the end of history, what you called, quote, the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. Do you have any regrets about that line, about that thesis, looking back now?
Well, no. You know, I wrote that in the middle of what's called the third wave of democratization, where the world went from having about 35 democracies to over 100 democracies. So there's a lot of movement in that direction. Over the last 10 years, we've been moving in the opposite direction, not dramatically, but in important ways, the rise of populism, rise of China, and so forth. And so obviously it's a different era. We're not converging like we seemed to be in the 1990s on liberal democracy. But in the long run, how durable that counter trend is, it's really not clear. I think that democracy still has a lot of support around the world, and you see this, constantly showing up in funny places like Armenia or Malaysia.
So you're fundamentally an optimist about the future?
Well, I just think that you need a balanced view. I think that people tend to get carried away by current events, and right now there's, I think, a little bit of excessive pessimism about global democracy, because I think democracy has more going for it than a lot of people would recognize right now.
Francis Fukuyama, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks for joining me on UpFront. That's our show. UpFront will be back next week.